Welcome to Green Thumb Nursery. We're going to talk about roses. So right now we have a pretty good selection of what we call dormant roses. They used to be bare root roses, and that's when the old packages with the sawdust and the roots inside this little bitty cylinder. Well, we've kind of evolved through the years to dormant roses. And what the difference is these roses are actually planted, potted in a pulp pot, which is a paper pot that will break down, and potting soil. So they can actually sit in this pot for a while. They can actually sprout in this pot. You can just treat it like a potted plant, although I don't recommend it necessarily. These are pretty much ready to be either put in another pot or put into the ground. So we're going to pot up this guy like right here. Now this one here, I experimented this year with some patio roses. I have about 4 varieties of patio roses. This one is called Cutie Pie. So it's like a miniature rose on about a 2-foot bush. So you're going to have the nice little roses. They're really cute. You could even have a little bud vase with a little cute bud. They look really nice as a bud, and as they open they look like a full-size rose, only they're little, like somebody shrunk them down. So I thought maybe it would be fun to plant up one of these roses in a pot, and this is something that you could put on your patio in a sunny location. All roses need at least 5 hours of direct sun or more, and you can certainly do them in a pot, not a problem. Most people go with too big of a pot. Even I in the past have gone with the too big of a pot, and they don't do as well right off the bat. They're busy trying to put roots into the pot, fill up the pot with roots, and then they start growing up on the top. So if you give them a little bit smaller pot, they're going to go a little bit faster. Well, this plant is only going to be a 2-foot plant, so it's actually going to be okay to stay in this pot probably for a long time. Couple years, maybe 3 or 4 years maybe. So let's go ahead and plant this guy up, and then I'm going to talk to you a little bit about how to take care of the roses once you get them planted, or existing roses that you may have. So what I've done now is, like I said, I picked a pot. It's not that much bigger than the actual container that it's in right now, and as I open this up you're going to see what it looks like in this pulp pot that they've put it in. And as you can see, there is dirt and the pot. Now there's a couple ways that you can do this. A lot of my rosarian friends would tell you to take this out of the soil and soak the roots in a bucket of water overnight with, you could use Super Thrive, you could use some seaweed extract, and then the next day you would go ahead and plant this thing like as if it were a bare root rose. It's not necessary to do that, but if that's something that you want to do, go for it. Also, I'm going to trim it up a little bit because I don't like this little branch that's going across in the middle right here. There's a crossing branch. So right off the bat, I'm going to go ahead and take that guy off of there. So now it's going to be a little more open in the middle. Because this is a miniature rose, I could have left it there, but my OCD is saying, oh, you need to get that out of there. So I got it out of there. Okay, so now on this one, there's 2 ways on this. You can either keep the pot on it, or you can take the pot off of it and plant it in here. If you do decide to keep the pot on it, then what I'll do is I'm going to leave the pot on this one so we can kind of show you, because that's the easiest method without having to disturb the roots. And this particular one, the soil's kind of loose on this one, so I'm afraid if I take the pot off it's just going to fall apart anyway. So I'm going to do it the way I would suggest you do it. And so what we're going to do is we're going to cut the bottom of the pot off. They are designed to deteriorate in the soil, but I find that the roses are ready to grow and get out of this pot right off the bat. So I'm going to go ahead and take off the bottom, and I'm going to slice it on the sides, one side or the other. Now it doesn't matter if you lose some soil That's okay. It's not going to cause any problems. And then I'm going to, now this pot is a little bit deeper than I need it to be, so I'm going to kind of measure it with my arm, and I can use about 1 inch or so of soil. And I'm using a potting soil, so if you're using containers, you want to use a potting soil. If you're doing it in the ground, you can use our rose mix. Now, I'm sure he will, my videographer will pan out and show you the bag of Fox Farms. I'm using a Fox Farms, what is this one called? Happy Frog. This is a new one that we started carrying. It has a lot of mycorrhizae fungus. It's got some fertilizers in it. It's a really good rich mix, and it's good for roots and flowers, which is what we're after on the roses. And we're going to top it with the Malibu Compost. And then if you're going to put it in the ground, you can use our rose and flower mix over here. And you're still going to put a top layer of the Malibu Compost on there, but this is what you would use if you're going to put it in the ground. I'm preferring this one here for potting soil because it's a little bit richer, not as much bark as the rose mix. So we're going to bring in our soil level a little bit, so then when I set this in here, I want just where the graft is, there's a root and then there's a graft, and this is where the bud union, they call it, and this is where they graft the branches that you want to come off of your root stock. So there's a root stock which is different from the actual plant that's on top, and they graft those pieces or buds onto the root union here, and then those take a hold and that becomes your bush. The root in here is a little bit stronger than the original roots. Some of them are grown on their own roots, but mostly now they have been budded onto the graft. So when we plant this, we want the soil level to be just below the graft union here. So I've got to maybe adjust it a little bit to get it where I need it to be, but I want to have about 1 inch lip from the top of the soil to the top of the pot, so that when I water, I can fill this up and give it a really good drink. So when I water, I fill it up to the rim, let it drain down, fill it up again, let it drain down one more time, fill it up again, let it drain down. That way you're really giving that root ball a nice saturation. So now I'm going to be able to hopefully set this guy in here at the right level. And he is. And I'm going to, actually I can pull this off of here. I'm going to just rip some of this pulp pot off of here. You don't want the lip of the pot to stick up above the soil level. What happens when that happens, great. When you do that, what will happen is the pot will act as a wick and actually wick up the moisture up out of the ground, which we don't want to do that. We want to keep the moisture down into the root ball area. So I'm just going to remove some of that pulp pot off the edge there. Now you could, now that this is in here in the space, if you really wanted to, you could pull off more of that pulp pot. And I think that's what I'm actually going to do, because it's falling apart. So no sense in leaving it in there. Okay. So now it's off of there, and I've got my root ball in here, and I'm going to adjust it to the right height, and then I'm going to backfill. Now, what I'm going to do, rather than giving it a fertilizer now, I'm going to use bone meal, and the one I'm using is called fish bone meal, so it's going to have a little bit of nitrogen in it, so it's going to help it to grow, but it's not a lot of nitrogen. We're not trying to really encourage this thing to get all crazy right off the bat. We're just giving it some help to get the roots going and to initiate some flowers later on as it starts to grow. Roses usually in the spring will grow after now you can also, when you trim these back, if you've got existing roses, you should have either are starting to trim them back now, or you've already trimmed them back to almost this state right here. Sometimes you can leave them a little bit longer, sometimes a little shorter. I just did a video on pruning, so if you haven't done your pruning and you need to know how, you can check out that video. So what you're going to do here is, after you've pruned your roses, or if you're planting the new roses, you're going to wait till you get a couple 2 inches of growth before you actually put a fertilizer, like a rose fertilizer. Right now, we're just going to kind of set the stage for the new growth to come out nice and healthy. So again, I'm going to backfill this up. Now before I get up to the top, now as you can see, my graft is right here, my union is here. So when I fill it up, I'm going to have about an inch or so of air right there that will help me to be able to saturate this plant nice and evenly. So before I get right up to the top, I'm going to go ahead and add some of the fertilizer. And I'm also going to add some Epsom salts. So, and you don't have to buy Epsom salts from a nursery. It's all the same stuff, just don't get it with fancy perfumes or things like that. You just need straight old Epsom salt, fairly inexpensive. The bone meal, I'm going to take a handful and I'm going to sprinkle it around the edge here. You don't want to overdo it because there is some nitrogen in here, so a handful should be plenty. And then just kind of mix it in the soil. And then we're going to take some of our Epsom salts and we're going to do about a tablespoon, about like that. And we're going to sprinkle that in around the top as well. Very good. And when I'm done with this, I will take it out and saturate it real well with water. You want to water it in, get the air circulate, or get the air bubbles out of the soil so it firms it down. You may need to add a little more soil. They kind of frown on me bringing a hose into the store, so I'll have to water it after I'm done. But you get the idea. Okay, so we're going to go ahead and fill this in. And just before we get right to the top, I'm going to add some Malibu Compost. Now I'm going to firm this down. Since I don't have my water, I want to kind of get the air out of there. And I'll do a little more soil. Now as you can see, this guy is getting ready to sprout. He's like, oh, I want to get to growing here. So, what did I do with my knife? I put it away. Okay, so I'm going to open this. And I'm going to top dress. Now Malibu Compost is a highly composted dairy cow manure. It doesn't stink, thank goodness. It's really good for the soil microbes and microorganisms. And what it does is it boosts those microorganisms, and it also encourages the other ones that are in the soil already to grow even faster and better. And what those microorganisms do is they break up the fertilizers, they break up the bark and the mulch that you put on there to make it readily available to the plant. It's kind of like if you have healthy soil, you have healthy plants. Now it took me a while to figure that out. I used to be the one where I want to give it a fertilizer and see it grow. Well, that's not necessarily good for the plant, and it's not necessarily good for the soil. So if you do your organic fertilizers, if you boost your microorganisms, the soil that I use, the Happy Frog, has a bunch of mycorrhizae fungus in there, which is soil organisms, microorganisms, and they help the plant to assimilate between the dirt and the root. And it actually helps it to get nutrient, it helps it to get water, it fends off diseases, it fends off insects to some extent. And just again, if you have healthy soil, you're going to have healthy plants. So it's important to get your soil healthy. Work on your soil. The plant will come naturally after that. So now I've got it pretty much the right level, and I can use just a little bit more. Now on a bare root, I'm still not used to using the dormant rows. On the dormant rows, when they're just before they're sprouting, I like to put a little bit of soil over the crown, the union here. Now some of you rosarians out there are going, oh my gosh, don't do that. Well, I like to do this because sometimes that union will dry out. And if we get any real dry winds, which we just recently had, and today we're having as well, a lot of winds, and that dries out the crown, and sometimes it'll dry out the canes as well. So if you cover this little root union while the plant's growing, now once it gets growing and you're getting ready to fertilize it, you've got your 2 inches of new growth and you're getting ready to fertilize it, you can take your hose and just gently wash that back off the crown of the plant. You don't want it to stay buried. And like you see here, I have mounded it up over. So are my soil levels here, then I mounded this up over. Once again, once it starts to grow, then you can wash that off of there, and then everything will be hunky-dory, because you're going to have your plants already growing. Nothing's going to dry out on you, provided that you water properly. Now, when you water these, like I said, you're going to fill it up to the rim, let it drain down, fill it up, let it drain down, fill it up, let it drain down. And what that does is that saturates this root ball. Now, if you're going to do it in a container, I suggest you use a moisture meter. Most people say, oh, those things don't work. Yes, they do. You just got to use them. Most people don't use them, or they use them once, and then the plant dies because they didn't use it again, and then they blame it on the moisture meter. Well, it's not the moisture meter, folks. It's you. Okay, what you do is you put this in the pot. It reads immediately. Now, as you can see, it's dry. Well, maybe you can't see. It's dry. The meter's showing that it's dry. So, and I know that because the soil has not been saturated. Now, when I go and water it, the meter should go all the way over to the blue. Now, when you go to water before, you want to wait until that meter gets down between the 4 and the 5. There's blue, which is wet, green, which is good, and red is dry. You want it to be headed to the red, but not into the red. So when it gets to that point, then it's time to saturate it again. And I usually try to do it about halfway between the pot and the plant. And on a pot like this, we're going to do it a couple inches. If it's a big pot, then you might do it a couple 4 inches down. And sometimes I'll do it on the back side, because sometimes when you water on this side is wet and that side's not. Now, if you fill it up like I told you, it should be evenly all throughout the root ball. But just in case, check it a couple times, and it reads immediately. So, and you don't leave it in there. You take it out. When I walk out on my patio, this guy goes into my pocket, and nothing gets water unless I meter it. So I know it works. It works for me, so it should be able to work for you. Okay, so now, if you're in the ground, you want 3 to 5 gallons worth of water. And you may need to put a little moat around it or mount some soil around it so that it's got a little water well in there so that you can do that and make sure that the water is staying in the root ball area. Now, once we get a couple inches of new growth, you can give it your rose fertilizer. And that you're just going to do kind of like I did here, sprinkle it around the edge, scratch it in, and water it in real well. Now, if you have a rose that's been in the same pot for many years, or you're using the same pot, same soil, you can use Azomite. And what Azomite does is it remineralizes that old soil. I would still suggest doing a top dressing of the Malibu Compost. And of course, you do all your little goodies in there, your Epsom salts, your bone meal, and your fertilizer. Top dress it with this. You could throw some Azomite in there. The Azomite's not going to burn anything, and that'll remineralize that soil. After about 5 or 6 years, you may need to, when you cut it back, pull the rose out, replace the soil if you want to keep it in that same pot, like it's grandma's pot and I don't want to get rid of it. You want to keep that pot, and you want to keep that rose in that pot, that's fine. You can pull it out, do a root prune, cut up the top, put some new soil in there, plant it like it's a bare root rose. And that way you can keep it in that same pot, and everybody's happy. You still got your prize rose in grandma's pretty pot. So that's pretty much it about the fertilizing. Now, I decided too, while I was here, that I would go ahead and plant some Alyssum around the base of this. I wouldn't suggest you going too crazy with a bunch of stuff, but the Alyssum is pretty carefree. It's not real invasive. It's not going to cause a lot of problems with the rose. And while you're waiting for this little guy to sprout back out and look all pretty, you've got something that's kind of keeping your interest in the meantime. Now, as this Alyssum grows, it will actually hang out over the edge of the pot and kind of hang down, so that kind of gives you that little combo look that looks so nice in the garden. So there we go. We're planted here with this. Now let's talk a little bit more about what you need to do to take care of this rose. Now we've got our fertilizers. We talked about the Epsom salts. The alfalfa meal is something that you can use on your existing roses. After you've pruned them back, you can actually throw the alfalfa meal on the rose at that point. And the alfalfa meal is a slow release nitrogen. So while the microorganisms in the soil are waking up, they can start tapping into this alfalfa meal as the soil temperatures get warmer, and start converting that to make it available to the rose. So this is a good thing that you can put on it after you've done your pruning. Now also, unfortunately, roses usually get three diseases mostly. It's the rust, powdery mildew, and black spot. There's a few other ones, but those are the three big ones. And usually you can kind of fend that off with a copper spray. Oops, this is, sorry, wrong one. You want to use a copper spray. Now I've got it in a concentrate, or you can use do a ready to use. And once you've trimmed it back, you'll go ahead and spray the canes and the ground around, and that'll help to keep the diseases from coming back from last year. Because those old dead leaves that are left on the plant or left on the ground can have spores, or the spores are like seeds of the diseases. They stay in the soil, and then when it rains or you water, it pops back up onto the plant, and it can get onto the leaves. Diseases need two things. It needs temperature and it needs moisture. If it has those two things, then it can germinate and grow. So if we can kind of either kill the spores or keep them from getting on the plant, or we don't water at night because that would encourage moisture, or we don't get moisture on the plant at night, that also encourages moisture, because when the water gets on the plant at night, it has a chance to sit all night long until the next day, and then the sun comes out and dries it off. So if you do it early morning, if you water early morning, then anything that got wet as soon as the sun comes out is going to dry that off of there. So you'll have less likely the issue of them getting the moisture they need to go ahead and grow. So the diseases, that is. Another thing that roses get, unfortunately, is they get it's called Bristly rose slug. It is a maggot it's the larva of a fly that hovers. They call it a hoverfly, and they lay the egg on the rose. This little guy hatches, and he chews little bitty holes in the leaves, and he'll leave basically just the vein of the rose and all these little holes around the veins of the rose. And you're like, what the heck happened? You look at it, there's nothing there. Because those guys go so quickly, they're so small that they pupate very rapidly, and by the time you see the holes in the leaves, those guys are long gone. So you can use this one here. This is a super insecticidal soap. This has Spinosad in it. Will actually sink into the plant and give you a little bit of prolonged protection. So when you first see the holes, you spray, and then you wait 10 days and give it another application. That should give you about 2 to 3 weeks of protection. Then when you start seeing the holes again, time to spray and repeat the application. If you kind of stay up on top of it, you will have less of it. Now, another thing they get is aphids. They get scales, they get whiteflies, they can get mealybugs. I like to use the oil spray for that. And the oil spray will kill the insects that are what we call our sucking insects. Yes, they all suck, but we're talking about the ones that only suck the juices out of the plant, not the chewers. We're talking about the suckers. So the ones those are the aphids, mealybugs, whiteflies. There's no holes in the leaves, but there's a sticky residue from their excretions, and usually you're getting ants in your plants. If you have ants in your plants, you got issues. So once you see those ants, there's usually something in there that's causing them to be attracted to that plant. And usually the oil spray is going to take care of that. This will also work for powdery mildew, which is awesome. And it's an oil spray, it's a mineral oil, so it's safe for you. It's not going to hurt you if you get it on you, if the kids get into it or the dog gets into it. It's not going to be a problem. And it also makes the leaf shiny, which is kind of cool. So you can use this once a week while you're having the issues. Hopefully by the time it gets into the warm weather, a lot of those things go away. Or you get another thing called a chili thrip, which makes the plants look like they're stunted. The leaves don't want to come out. The flowers get all brown and funky. They don't want to open right. That usually happens when it gets really hot. So as the season progresses, you have different issues that you're dealing with. Anytime you have a problem, you can certainly bring us a sample, and we'll be more than happy to help you figure out what you need to take care of that problem. So another thing that I like to recommend is the John and Bob Soil Optimizer. This is a good one to put on in the spring, and you also do it again in the fall. And you can do this on everything in your yard, your fruit trees, everything. This has got a lot of it's got humectic acids in it, which is something that's readily available to the plant. It's been broken down already, so the plant can just uptake it. It's got sulfur in there to help lower the pH, because we don't get a lot of rain here. Our pH happens to be pretty high, and so is our water. Our water is very alkaline. So every time you water with your alkaline water, you're bringing your pH up. So this kind of helps that. Roses actually like to be a little below the neutral. So 7 is neutral. Anything below that is acidic, and they like to be slightly acidic. So this will help with that. So will the iron. That's another thing that you can apply. I like to apply iron when I'm doing my fertilizer. Fertilizers you do every 6 to 8 weeks. So when you start, once you get your new growth on there, you use this fertilizer, and then you repeat about every 6 to 8 weeks after that until you cut it back again in the fall. In the winter time. Again, if the soil temperature gets below 50 degrees, you really don't need to do a lot of fertilizing, but you could use a liquid fertilizer and do a foliar spray, and that'll go right into the system of the plant. The roses really like the fish fertilizer. This is a great source of nitrogen, and the seaweed extract. Now there are products that have both. Some people are allergic to seaweed, so I'm not, I'm giving you an option, but there is one that has both products in it, so you can just do one shot on that. And this will help to keep them nice and healthy and green and growing until you're ready to cut them back. So let's see, I've got the diseases, I got the bugs, I got the fertilizers. Oh yes, the Malibu Compost tea. This right here is part of the Malibu family. They take a poultice and put it in there's a tea bag. There's 4 tea bags in here. You steep the tea bag in a gallon or 2 of water overnight usually, or about 8 hours, and then you can pour that on into the soil, or you can actually put it in a hose end sprayer and spray it on the foliage, and that will go into the plant as well. You can do this spring, midsummer, and fall. It's a really good thing. You can do it on your whole yard. In fact, I've used it before, and I tell you that every time I use it, it seems like I come out the next day and the plants are just like, oh, because they just love it. And the bugs don't like this because they're getting sprayed with manure. So they're like, get me out of here. So it's really a good product to use in between your fertilizings even. You could really, if you look at what rosarians do to get their prize roses, they're doing something to those roses every month. But we don't have to do that. We're not trying to win, unless you are. If you're trying to win a prize, then yes, you could do that. But if you do what I'm saying here, it's really minimal care, and you're still going to get the nice results, and you're going to have some beautiful flowers that you can share, you can cut, you can bring into the house, or you can just enjoy them in a pot or in your yard. So I think that's about it for today. So if you have any other questions, please come into Green Thumb. We'd love to see you, and we still have a really good selection of the dormant roses, and we would love to help you select